Doctors gave up on the billionaire's son, then a black single dad did the impossible. The machine beeped once, then fell silent. Every monitor in the room flatlined at the same second, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that hospital room breathed. Then a man in faded scrubs that didn't match anyone else's uniform pushed past 2 specialists, dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed, and pressed both hands against the boy's chest like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Someone get me a crash cart," he said, voice flat and steady, "and get out of my way." Behind the glass, Marcus Whitfield, the richest man in 3 counties, a man who'd built an empire out of steel and stubbornness, grabbed the nearest doctor by the collar. "Who is that? Who let a janitor touch my son?" The doctor didn't answer, because the doctor didn't know either. Nobody in that hospital knew the man's real name. To the staff, he was just Elijah, the quiet man who mopped the pediatric wing floors at night and sometimes sat with lonely kids when their parents couldn't make visiting hours. He'd been there 8 months. He kept his head down. He asked for nothing. But right now, with his hands moving in perfect rhythm on a dying 12-year-old's chest, counting under his breath like a man reciting scripture, he didn't look like a janitor at all. "Sir, you need to step back," a nurse said, reaching for his shoulder. "I need 30 more seconds," Elijah said, without looking up. "Then you can fire me." Marcus Whitfield pounded on the glass, screaming his son's name. 3 specialists stood frozen, watching a man they'd never once looked directly in the eye do something none of them had been fast enough to do. And then, impossibly, one of the flat lines on the monitor jumped. Nobody in that room understood what they were watching yet. They didn't know why a hospital janitor's hands moved like a trauma surgeon's. They didn't know what Elijah Carter had done before he ever picked up a mop. All they knew was that the boy everyone had already said goodbye to had just, somehow, come back. 8 months earlier, none of this seemed possible, because 8 months earlier, Elijah Carter wasn't trying to save anyone's life. He was just trying to keep his own family standing. Elijah was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair going gray at the edges faster than he liked to admit and hands that always looked a little too steady for a man who supposedly just pushed a mop around all day. He didn't talk much. He smiled easily but rarely laughed out loud. If you passed him in a hallway, you'd probably just see a tired man in scrubs, keys jingling at his hip, eyes that seemed to be somewhere else half the time. What you wouldn't see, because Elijah made very sure you never did, was the person he used to be. 8 years earlier, Elijah had been one of the most respected trauma surgeons at a major city hospital, the kind of surgeon other doctors called in when a case looked unsurvivable. He'd built a career on being the last hope in the room, the one who didn't flinch when everyone else did. Then, on a rainy November night, a drunk driver ran a red light and hit the car his wife was in, and Elijah spent 6 hours operating on strangers while his own wife died 2 floors below him, in a room he wasn't allowed to enter because hospital policy didn't let surgeons treat family. He never went back to that hospital. He barely went back to medicine at all. Grief did something to him that no medical degree had prepared him for. He pulled his son, Micah, out of the city, moved 3 states away to a quiet town nobody had heard of, and took the first steady job that didn't ask too many questions, night custodian at Ridgeview Children's Hospital. It wasn't running away, not exactly. It was more like Elijah had decided the version of himself that saved lives had died in that hospital hallway right alongside his wife, and the only thing left to protect now was an 8-year-old boy who needed his father to come home every night, not get paged away at 3 a.m. to save somebody else's family instead of showing up for his own. Micah was 10 now, sharp as a tack, obsessed with dinosaurs and terrible knock-knock jokes, and completely unaware that his father used to hold human hearts in his hands for a living. Elijah liked it that way. Quiet was safe. Quiet meant nobody expected anything from him he wasn't ready to give again. Ridgeview Children's Hospital sat on the edge of town, a modest building that mostly treated small-town emergencies, broken arms, bad flus, the occasional car accident. It wasn't the kind of place that handled miracles. It was the kind of place that handled Tuesdays. Which was exactly why Elijah had chosen it. Everything changed the week Marcus Whitfield's private jet landed at the regional airport. Marcus Whitfield was 51, self-made, and proud of every inch of the empire he'd built, from a single steel fabrication plant into a multi-billion-dollar company with his name stamped on half the skyline of the nearest city.
He wasn't cruel in the cartoon villain sense.
He was cruel the way powerful men often are, casually, thoughtlessly, the way you might step over a homeless man on your way into a restaurant without registering he was ever there. Money had solved every problem in Marcus's life for so long that he'd genuinely forgotten some problems didn't care how much you were worth. His son, Tyler, was 12 years old, and had collapsed at a private tennis academy 2 states away. What followed was a terrifying blur of ambulances, private specialists, and finally, an emergency transfer to Ridgeview, the closest hospital equipped to stabilize him after his heart had gone into a rhythm none of his own specialists could immediately explain. The plan was to stabilize him just long enough to fly him somewhere real, as Marcus put it more than once, loud enough for the nursing staff to hear. Marcus arrived at Ridgeview like a storm system. He took over a private wing, flew in 3 of his own specialists within 18 hours, and made it clear to every staff member he encountered that he considered this small-town hospital a temporary inconvenience standing between his son and the doctors who actually mattered. Elijah first saw Tyler Whitfield through the glass of his hospital room on a Tuesday night shift, mopping the hallway outside. The boy looked impossibly small in that bed, tubes and monitors dwarfing him, his father pacing outside the door barking orders into a phone instead of sitting beside him. Something in Elijah's chest tightened, quiet and unbidden, the specific ache of watching a child suffer while the adults around him argued about logistics instead of just being present.
He didn't say anything. He wasn't a doctor here.
He was Elijah, the night janitor, and he'd built his whole careful life around staying exactly that. But he kept noticing things.
Little things.
The way Tyler's heart monitor occasionally spiked in a pattern that looked oddly familiar. The way the specialists debated in hushed, uncertain voices in the hallway, throwing out diagnoses that didn't quite fit what Elijah, invisible, mop in hand, could hear through the door. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that every single night for the next several weeks, and every single night, it got a little harder to believe.
The first real incident happened during Elijah's second week on Tyler's floor.
He was refilling paper towel dispensers outside the boys' room when Marcus Whitfield stormed out, phone still glued to his ear, and nearly walked straight into him. Marcus looked at him the way you'd look at a piece of hallway furniture that had inconveniently moved. "Watch where you're standing," Marcus snapped, not even pausing his phone call, already walking away.
Elijah said nothing.
It wasn't the first time a man like Marcus had looked through him instead of at him, and it wouldn't be the last. He'd learned a long time ago which battles were worth fighting and which ones you just let roll past you like weather.
But Tyler had seen it.
The boy, awake and restless despite the exhaustion in his eyes, had watched the whole exchange through the open door. "Sorry about my dad," Tyler said quietly, when Elijah came in later to empty the trash.
"He's not usually that bad.
He's just scared." Elijah paused, surprised.
Most 12-year-olds wouldn't have noticed, let alone apologized.
"You don't need to apologize for him," Elijah said gently.
"Scared people say things they don't mean. Do you think I'm going to be okay?"
Tyler asked, and there was something so raw and direct in the question that Elijah's whole practiced composure nearly cracked. He chose his next words carefully. "I think you've got some really smart people trying very hard to figure this out." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't quite an answer either. Tyler seemed to sense that, the way sick kids often develop a radar for half-truths, but he didn't push. He just nodded, small and tired, and closed his eyes. Elijah left that room with his chest tighter than it had been in years. The second incident came a few days later, and it wasn't really about Elijah at all, but it changed something in him anyway. There was a nurse on the pediatric floor named Priya, young, earnest, still finishing her clinical hours, the kind of nurse who genuinely lit up around her small patients even on brutal double shifts. She'd made a small, understandable documentation error on Tyler's chart, nothing dangerous, just a mistiming in a medication log that any competent doctor would catch and correct in 30 seconds. Marcus found out about it before any doctor did, and he lost his composure entirely. "Are you trying to kill my son?" he shouted at her in the hallway, loud enough that the sound carried through half the floor.
"Do you have any idea who I am? I will have your license. I will make sure you never work in medicine again."
Priya stood there, visibly shaking, apologizing over and over, while Marcus continued, spiraling into a rant about incompetence and small-town hospitals not being fit to treat someone like his son. Elijah, mopping nearby, felt something old and sharp rise up in him, the specific fury of watching someone use fear as a weapon against a person with far less power than them.
He didn't intervene, not directly, not yet.
But he made sure Priya's supervisor heard the real story before Marcus's version reached hospital administration. He made sure, quietly, without ever taking credit, that Priya didn't lose her job over a mistake that had already been fixed and had never once put Tyler in danger. It was the kind of thing Elijah could do without anyone noticing, and that was exactly how he preferred it. But watching Priya cry in the break room later that night, watching a good, hard-working young woman get torn apart by a man who'd never once bothered to learn her name, planted something in Elijah that he couldn't quite mop away. The third incident happened when Tyler took a sudden, frightening turn, and the hospital's on-call specialists disagreed sharply about how to respond. Elijah happened to be in the hallway, restocking supplies, when he overheard the argument through the half-open door, two specialists debating a diagnosis in increasingly tense voices, throwing around terms and rhythms that made something old and dormant flare awake behind Elijah's ribs.
He recognized the pattern they were describing.
He'd seen it before, years ago, in a case eerily similar to this one, back when he still wore a different kind of uniform.
He almost said something. His hand actually rose toward the doorframe.
Then he stopped himself, stepped back, and kept walking, jaw tight, mop bucket rattling behind him. That night, lying awake long after his shift ended, Elijah stared at the ceiling of his small rented house and thought about his wife. About the 6 hours he'd spent saving strangers while she died 2 floors below him. About the vow he'd made afterward, half out of grief and half out of self-preservation, that he was done being the man other people needed in emergencies.
He was just going to be Micah's father. Nothing more. Nothing that could be taken away from him again.
But he kept thinking about Tyler's small, tired voice asking, "Do you think I'm going to be okay?" The fourth incident, the one that finally cracked something open, happened 3 days later, and it wasn't about Tyler at all.
It was about Micah.
Elijah's son had a school project due, some presentation about what your parents do for work, and Micah, proud and matter-of-fact in the way only a 10-year-old can be, had stood up in front of his class and said his dad cleaned floors at the children's hospital and made sure sick kids had someone to talk to at night. A classmate, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way kids sometimes are, had laughed and said, "That's not a real job. That's just, like, mopping." Micah came home upset, not because he was embarrassed of his father, but because he didn't understand why other kids thought what his dad did wasn't important. Elijah sat with him on the porch that evening, Micah's small shoulders slumped, and found himself in the strange position of reassuring his son that quiet, humble work still mattered, while carrying, silently, the enormous unspoken truth of who he used to be and why he'd buried it. Some of the most important things people do, Elijah told him, don't come with fancy titles.
Remember that. Micah nodded, only half convinced, and Elijah spent the rest of that night wrestling with a question he hadn't let himself ask in years. What was he actually protecting Micah from, by staying hidden? And what might it cost someone else if he kept hiding forever?
The turning point came 4 days later, on a night that started like every other night and ended like nothing that had come before it.
Tyler's heart went into full arrest just after 11 p.m.
The alarms hit all at once, a shriek of monitors, a flood of staff rushing into the room, Marcus Whitfield's voice cracking through the hallway in raw, desperate panic. Elijah was 2 doors down, restocking a linen cart, when he heard it, and something in him simply stopped being Elijah the janitor and became, instantaneously and completely, Dr. Elijah Carter again.
He didn't remember deciding to run into that room.
His body simply did it, muscle memory built over a decade of trauma surgery kicking in before his conscious mind caught up. He pushed past a stunned nurse, dropped to his knees beside the bed, and began chest compressions with a precision that made every trained professional in that room freeze for half a second in confusion before their training caught up with what they were seeing. "Someone get me a crash cart," he said, voice steady, commanding, utterly unlike the quiet janitor anyone in that hospital had ever known, "and get out of my way." A doctor started to object. Elijah cut him off without even looking up. "I need epinephrine, 0.1 milligrams, now, and I need someone bagging him at 10 breaths a minute starting this second." The specificity, the certainty in his voice, silenced the room faster than any raised voice could have. Outside the glass, Marcus Whitfield grabbed the nearest staff member by the collar, screaming for someone to explain who was touching his son. Nobody answered him, because nobody entirely understood it themselves yet. They just watched a hospital janitor perform textbook-perfect emergency resuscitation on a boy every specialist in that room had quietly begun preparing to lose.
30 seconds stretched into a minute.
Elijah counted under his breath, hands never faltering, sweat beating at his temple, every instinct he'd spent 8 months trying to bury roaring back to life all at once. And then, on the monitor, a flat line jumped. Then another. Tyler's heart, against every prepared goodbye in that room, started beating again. The room exploded into motion, nurses calling out vitals, doctors stepping back in stunned silence, one of them whispering, almost reverently, "That's not standard protocol, that's exactly what worked in the Hendricks case study." Another specialist, older, more experienced, looked at Elijah with sudden sharp recognition dawning across his face. "Wait," the older doctor said slowly. "I know that technique. I know that exact sequence. That's Carter's approach. That's Elijah Carter's protocol. I read his paper in my residency." He stopped, staring at the man in janitor's scrubs kneeling on the floor, chest heaving. "You're Dr. Elijah Carter." The room went utterly silent, except for the steady, miraculous beeping of a heart monitor that, 5 minutes earlier, everyone had believed would never beep again. Marcus Whitfield burst through the door at that exact moment, and stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the janitor he'd shoved past in the hallway less than 2 weeks earlier, now kneeling beside his son's bed with hands that had just brought him back from the edge of death. "What?" Marcus said, voice shaking, "did you just call him?" The older doctor answered, still staring at Elijah like he was seeing a ghost. "Dr. Elijah Carter. One of the finest trauma surgeons this state has ever produced. He vanished from medicine almost a decade ago. Nobody knew what happened to him." Elijah, still catching his breath on the floor beside Tyler's bed, finally looked up, not at the doctors, not at the stunned nurses, but directly at Marcus Whitfield. "I happened to be here," Elijah said quietly, "when it mattered." Marcus's face went through a rapid, visible collapse of certainty. The wealthy man who'd spent 2 weeks treating this hospital and everyone in it as beneath his notice now staring at the one person in the building who had actually saved his son's life, and realizing, in real time, exactly how badly he'd misjudged him. "I don't understand," Marcus said, voice cracking. You've been mopping floors. Why would a surgeon like you be mopping floors?" Elijah stood slowly, joints aching, years of carefully buried grief suddenly very close to the surface. "Because 8 years ago, I lost my wife in a hospital hallway while I was 2 floors down saving someone else's family instead of being there for mine. I decided I was done being needed by strangers. I just wanted to be there for my son." He glanced toward Tyler, whose eyes were fluttering open, weak but alive. "I wasn't planning on getting involved tonight. But your son asked me if he was going to be okay, and I couldn't just keep mopping floors and pretend I didn't know how to help him." Marcus stood frozen, the enormity of the last 2 weeks crashing down on him all at once. Every dismissive comment, every moment he'd looked straight through the man who would end up saving his son's life, every time he'd screamed at overworked staff instead of simply sitting with his own child. He looked, for the first time since arriving at Ridgeview, genuinely, completely humbled. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said quietly. "I owe you more than that. I don't even know where to start." "You can start," Elijah said, "by sitting with your son. He's been asking for you more than he's been asking for specialists." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. What followed over the next several days was not the story of a billionaire throwing money at a problem to fix it, though he certainly tried that too. Elijah politely, firmly declined every initial offer of a reward, a position, a headline-grabbing donation with his name attached to it. What Marcus eventually understood, slowly and with visible difficulty, was that Elijah didn't want to be paid for what he'd done. He wanted, more than anything, to be allowed to keep being quietly, humbly Micah's father, without the whole world suddenly deciding they owned a piece of him. But Marcus, to his credit, didn't just walk away either. He sat with Priya, the young nurse he'd screamed at over a minor documentation error, and apologized to her directly and specifically, in front of her supervisor, making it clear the mistake had been corrected long before it mattered and that his reaction had been completely unfair. He personally funded her final clinical training costs, not as a headline gesture, but quietly, because it was the right thing to do for someone he genuinely wronged. He also sat down with the hospital administration and, at Elijah's request, funded an anonymous scholarship for local nursing and medical students from working-class families, the kind of families, Elijah pointed out gently, that rarely got second chances the way wealthy families always seem to. Marcus differentiated, too, in ways that mattered. He didn't lump every doctor or staff member together in some sweeping act of guilt. He recognized which of his own outbursts had genuinely caused harm and made those right individually. He recognized, too, that some of the staff who'd simply stayed quiet during his tantrums weren't villains, just ordinary people intimidated by a powerful, frightened man, doing their best in an impossible situation. He extended grace where grace made sense, and accountability where accountability was earned. Tyler recovered fully over the following weeks. The mysterious cardiac episode ultimately traced back to a rare but treatable condition that Elijah's specific expertise had identified before any of the visiting specialists caught up. The boy asked, more than once, if Elijah would come visit even after he was discharged, and Elijah, somewhat to his own surprise, found himself saying yes. Micah and Tyler ended up meeting a few weeks later, an awkward but genuinely sweet friendship forming between the billionaire's son and the janitor's son, built entirely on shared dinosaur facts and terrible jokes, blissfully unaware of how much history and heartbreak had brought their fathers into the same orbit. Elijah didn't go back to being a full-time trauma surgeon. Not exactly. The wound from losing his wife hadn't magically healed just because one boy's heart had started beating again. But something in him had shifted, quietly and permanently. He started picking up occasional shifts in the ER, slowly, carefully, on his own terms, not chasing the old identity he'd buried, but allowing pieces of it back into his life without letting it swallow him whole again. I used to think I had to choose, he told Marcus once, months later, the two of them sitting on a porch that neither of them could have imagined sharing a season earlier. Either I was a surgeon, or I was a father. I forgot, for a while, that I could just be a man who shows up when it matters, in whatever way that looks like. Marcus, humbled in a way his money had never managed to humble him before, nodded slowly. I used to think respect was something you demanded, he admitted. Turns out it's something you're supposed to give first, especially to the people you'd never bother to notice otherwise. Word of what happened at Ridgeview eventually got out, the way these stories tend to. Reporters called. A few tried to turn Elijah into a headline, the hidden hero janitor, the miracle surgeon in disguise. Elijah declined almost every interview. The one thing he did agree to was a short, quiet statement, released not for attention, but because he thought it might matter to somebody out there struggling the way he had. I spent 8 years thinking that hiding from what I used to be was the only way to protect what I had left, the statement read. I was wrong. You don't have to choose between healing and helping. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't running from who you were, it's letting who you were and who you've become finally sit in the same room together. He went back to Ridgeview that night, like he did most nights, mop in hand, keys jingling at his hip, except now, occasionally, a stethoscope hung around his neck too, when the ER needed an extra set of steady hands. Nobody looked at him like just the janitor anymore. But more importantly, he didn't need them to. He'd simply become, at last, all the things he'd always quietly been: a father, a healer, and a man who finally understood that the two had never actually been in conflict at all. Doctors had given up on Tyler Whitfield that night, because doctors only had charts and statistics to go on. What they didn't have was a man who'd once lost everything and had quietly decided, in the space of 30 desperate seconds, that he wasn't willing to let one more family feel that same loss if there was anything left in him to stop it.